is Jean Hogue. I was born in 1935 to Vance and Hazel Strickland, and I was born in Fort Myers, Florida at my grandmother Ona's home, and we returned to my other grandparents, Norwood and Barbara Strickland, who lived on Terry Street, and that's where we resided for several years. And my dad, Vance Strickland, worked for his father at the sawmill. And at one time, just a few years later, we had a commissary. The Stricklands had a commissary down where the old drugstore used to be, down on Old 41. And they had a commissary in there, and we lived in the back of it. My mom, dad, and I lived in the back of that commissary. And my mother ran the commissary for my granddaddy's sawmill. And from there, we moved over onto Old 41 into one of the houses there across from the Wonder Gardens. And at that time, I believe it was called the Reptile Gardens. And our dad went to work for the Army down in Naples, at the base down in Naples. And he worked there for a few years. And then he was drafted at the age of 36 years of age. He was drafted into the Second World War, 1943, I believe it was. And at that point, my mother moved Jerry and I back to Fort Myers to live with our grandparents up there. And we lived there with them with her for, maybe 45 years. My dad came home from the military, and he got a job at the post office in Fort Myers, and he was walking the beat with a bag, delivering mail door to door. Did that for a few years, and then he was transferred down here to Bonita Springs to be assistant postmaster here. My mother was assistant postal person. She delivered mail as a substitute, and we moved back to Bonita, and Dad rented a little house over on Pullen. It belonged to Will Gibson, who was one of the county commissioners at that time. And we lived there for 2 or 3 years, and then we moved down the street to the A&M Smith house on the corner of, actually it was right across the street from the school. And at one time, even classes were held in that building. A&M Smith House building where we lived in. School was held over there in some of the rooms. My dad purchased that house, and we lived in it until he died. And I went to school there, in that school. Actually, I have to go back a little bit. My paternal grandmother, Ona Hendricks, lived in Kentucky, in Murray, Kentucky. She and her husband, John, my granddaddy John, lived in Murray, Kentucky. And she had a cousin that lived here in Bonita Springs called George Watkins. And at one time, he owned several houses on Goodwin. From Goodwin all the way over to Terry, he owned property. And all the way to the Imperial Boulevard. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Her cousin called her, I guess it maybe sent a telegram to her in Kentucky, and told her that there was work to be had here for my granddaddy John, for him to come and bring some men with him. And they were building houses for the men that were working on the railroad. And so my grandfather and a few men came, and this was in 1923, I believe, and right after the school was built. So when my grandfather got here and kind of got his wits about him, he found out that there was a school here and they needed teachers, and my grandmother was a teacher. And so he sent a telegram back to Kentucky and sent for her and the children. My grandmother brought them on the train to Fort Myers, and then she said Granddaddy John met her, and she said it took all day long to come from the Fort Myers to Bonita. I think probably I was 7. My grandmother became a school teacher on Sanibel Island. And she took me with her. And I went on Sanibel Island and lived with my grandmother for a year. I think I was in the 2nd grade. And it was a 2-room schoolhouse because there was no transportation to get children off the island back to the mainland, except by ferry, which ran maybe twice a day, maybe not even that. We lived in what they called the teacher's house over on Sanibel, furnished by Mr. Bailey, who was one of the big persons on Sanibel Island at that time, owned a lot of land, owned the grocery store. And we had no water, running water. We had a cistern that it would, can't think of the word now, but gravitate into the house. And we had no electricity. We had lanterns we had to light every night when it got dark. We had no air conditioning, of course. And we had no car. So my grandmother had to make arrangements every day for us to be picked up by someone else and taken on the other side of the island where the school was. And that was just enchanting to me. I got to play in the bay every day. We lived on the bay side, and I got to live on the island, and my grandmother was so ingenious. She could come up with all kinds of wonderful ideas to entertain you. Like we had to have multiple matches because we had to light lanterns and stoves. And she would take them and she'd make them into little jewelry boxes and little boxes to put shells in and little boxes. You know, she was just so talented, and she could take a paper and fold it 4, 5, 6 times, and she could cut you out a string of dolls this long. And she could take a newspaper and cut a pattern out of it and make me a dress in a day. She's a very talented lady. Anyway, I'm going back to Imperial, pulling that street where we lived. And Jerry and I went to school in the little elementary school there, but it only went through the 9th grade. And so we had to take a bus all the way into Fort Myers to go to high school, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. Every day we got on a bus at 7 o'clock, and about 4 o'clock in the afternoon we got back home. And we did that till we graduated. And after I graduated, I went to South Carolina, and I stayed a year with an aunt up there. I met my husband, of course, before that and was dating him. So we got engaged in 1954. We got married, and we had 3 children, our oldest son, Joe, and our middle son, Kelly, and our daughter, Jill, who lives in Wyoming. And we then purchased land behind my parents on Shriver, and we built a house there. And we lived in that until I moved to Lakeland. Bonita was a wonderful place to live in our time. It was just a small community, maybe 400 or 500 people was all that lived here. Everybody knew everybody. It was a frightening time because we went through the Second World War here, where they had boats out in the Gulf of Mexico here, you know, we had to have our windows blacked out. We had to have our car lights blacked out. There were food rationings. There was a little building right down in front of where the post office was that my brother Jerry could probably tell you more about this, but it was a little building that men took turns watching for airplanes at night. And my dad would take a watch, and Jerry frequently would go with him, and they had pictures, he said, on the walls of all the airplanes they needed to identify, you know, and everything. But the beach was wonderful. Everybody just loved the beach here, you know, all of us kids. We had no closed doors, you know. Kids could just get on their bicycles and go to the beach and stay all day. Parents didn't worry about us. And of course, we knew the Krantz very well, the Grant children, Joanne and Joan and Diane Krant, and their people. We knew them well. We belonged to the Methodist Church when it was the little original Methodist Church. My grandmother was a charter member there, and my dad was on the board there. And I was very active in that. I taught Bible school, I taught Sunday school, I sang in the choir. I was head of the kitchen for a lot of years. I was head of the Lord's Quilters for several years. And then I involved into some of the community work. I worked at the library from the time the library started, over in one little room over behind the old community hall here on 41. And when it moved over to the park over off of Terry, I went as well over there and worked in the library. Then when the city became a city, we became a city. You know, there was a time when Bonita was not a city. I can't remember the dates, but we did become a city. Then I got involved in it, and we began to have the the mayor's survey, and I ran for mayor one year and became the mayor of Survey for 1 year.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jean Hogue. I'm presently now the mayor of Survey. I was just elected in July of this year, 2008, to be mayor of Survey.
When I gave my speech for the mayor of Survey, one of my pledges was I promised that everybody would have a guava tree in their yard, and the sand spurs would be put back on the sidewalks, and everybody would have a mullet in the frying pan. But every year I entered the pie contests and won many years for my pies. I was known for my pies. I made strawberry pies, and I made chocolate pie, and I made coconut cream pie. And it was always a competition kind of between Dolly and me. I think she got a little perturbed with me because I won sometimes instead of her. But anyway, it was all in good fun.
Very proud to be mayor of Old Survey.
Well, at one time I was president of the Ladies Auxiliary, the American Legion. It was very hard because I had children at that time, and it involved a lot of traveling and things, and I just couldn't do that. I worked in the school when my children were over there. I was assistant to the nurse there for the school, at the elementary school. And I helped in the cafeteria because my mother-in-law ran the cafeteria. And so when she needed help in the kitchen, I was always available to run across the street almost to help her. I had a large group of girlfriends. And we'd play jacks, and we'd play hopscotch. And then as we got older, of course the beach, as I said, we were very involved in the beach. And the boys had the river, we had the beach. We had bicycles, some of us, and we rode bicycles around. When we got to be a teenager, my dad formed a teenage club down at the community hall. And every Saturday night we would have a square dance. And he even went and took lessons to learn how to call a square dance. And he was such a good dad, always thinking of how he could help us, you know, like he formed a scout group for my brother as well. There was no movies, there was no soda fountains, there was nothing to do for a date except to go either to Fort Myers or to Naples. And of course my parents were very strict. I had to be home at 10 o'clock. But sometimes they would be lenient and let me go to Naples or Fort Myers to go to a movie. Or there was a little place across the street over here. I can't remember the name of it now, but he did have hamburgers and hot dogs and sodas in there, and we would go there on a little date, you know. But a lot of times we would double date because not a lot of the boys didn't have cars. And Robert Lawhon had a car. My husband had a car. Well, Naplesville didn't have much either. They had a theater though, and we would go there. That was the closest, and we would go there for the theater. One I remember very, very fondly was I loved comedy. I loved to laugh. If you ever heard me laugh, you could hear me from here to Bonita. But anyway, Abbott and Costello was just one of my favorites. And my husband took me to see a movie one time in Fort Myers. It was Abbott and Costello. And he got up and walked out and left me because I made so much noise laughing.
You want to be the manager of the baseball team?
Yes.
You know the guys' names?
Well, I should.
Well, you tell me the guys' names on the baseball
I
team.
say, who's on first? What's on second? I don't know who's on third.
You ain't saying nothing to me yet. Go ahead and tell me.
I'm telling him.
You ain't
Look,
said nothing yet. Go ahead and tell me.
who's on first? What's on second? I don't know is on third.
You know the guys' names on the baseball team?
Yes.
Well, go ahead. Who's on first?
Yes.
I mean the guy's name.
Who?
The guy playing first.
Who?
The guy playing first base.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
What are you asking me for? I don't know.
Well, in 1954, I got married at the Little Methodist Church in Bonita Springs, and my husband was in the military at that time at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, so we moved there, and we stayed there for a year until he finished his basic his training, and then he was discharged, and we came back to Bonita, and at that time he was fishing with his father, John Hogue, on the Bonita. We lived in a little cottage over here on in Bonita, and fishing just really became no money was to be made there. So he went to work for Brack Electric in Naples, and from there he worked for different contractors down there, and finally he joined the union in Miami and became a union electrician, and he worked at Marco Island for many years. And then in probably 1970, 74, 75, the bottomists fell out here for union work. And so we started traveling at that point. Our children were raised pretty much. Jill was still with us, but our boys were grown and out of the house. And so we became on the road electricians. We bought a travel trailer and we traveled all over the United States for 22 years. Just had a wonderful time. Just saw everything you could think of from coast to coast. Met many people, just loved it. Had a bad accident in 1980. We turned our trailer over on ice and wrecked the whole thing, lost the whole rig. Thank goodness we weren't hurt. But it didn't stop us. We just got up and shook ourselves off, bought another trailer and started again. And we did that until we retired in 1992. Bonita grew by leaps and bounds in those 22 years that we were on the road. I-75 went in, bypassed Bonita, made a lot of changes in Bonita. A lot of the stores here closed down because of the bypass, like the Shell factory moved away. La Han's grocery moved out away, out to closer to the interstate, to New 41. We saw a lot of building. The beaches just grew by leaps and bounds, of course. They found the beach. And at one time, I could count on one hand the houses that were on the beach. It made it easier to travel because of the interstate and the more roads, and everything, and better roads. And then the city became incorporated, and we just progressed right along, and the Historical Society was formed, and I was part of that when I lived here. Well, I just don't remember it being hard at all. We had no TV, we had no phones, very few phones. The grocery stores, maybe, the tavern, I think, had a phone. The hotel maybe had a phone. But very few people had phones. We had no air conditioning. I don't remember air conditioning at all in homes here until probably late 40s, maybe even late 50s. I didn't have it until, I think I got air conditioning in my home maybe in 1970. And that was only because I went to work and I worked in air conditioning and I couldn't stand it any longer. People didn't really visit much because it took all your energy just to maintain for a day, getting meals prepared, cleaning your house. You had laundry to do. You had to hang your clothes on the line. I can remember hanging baby diapers on my clothesline and my legs would just be black with mosquitoes. Mosquitoes were horrible here. This was before spraying. We had an old spray gun. Daddy would fill with some kind of spray. And every night he'd go around and spray all the rooms. Of course, it just about killed you, the smell of the spray. but at least you didn't get bitten. I don't know what it did to our lungs, but yes, there was a lot of mosquitoes. Oh my. I worked for the Bonita Banner for a short while, and I would go into Naples and Fort Myers, and I would solicit ads to put in the paper, the Bonita Banner for Bob Parrott and his wife. And I didn't do that very long, maybe a couple of years. And then I went to work for Hodges in Naples, which was a funeral home. And I worked there for a couple of years. And then when Pittman put in his funeral home here in Bonita, I just decided it was easier to work here. And I did for several years. And it was very interesting work. It's almost spiritual, you know, because you can help people through their grief. And a lot of these people, I shouldn't say a lot, but many of the people that died were northern people. And it was like they had come down here for the winter, or they'd come down here to build and live, and all their family was in the north. And there would be a wife or a husband left alone, you know, and they had no support. And that's where I came in. To grow up in Bonita Springs was just enchanting. It really was. Like I said, everybody was friends. Everybody knew everybody. Everybody shared. Bonita will always be a special place in my heart. It was my home for 75 years. In 2011, my life changed drastically, and I moved to Lakeland. But I will always miss Bonita, and I will always call Bonita home. It's the most beautiful place in the world.